Thank you very much. This is going to be a three-handed talk. I'm Matthew Slocum. I'm director of the SPAB. With me is Johnny Garlick, our Special Operations Officer, and Graham Keevil, too, who's the Society's consultant archaeologist at Boxley. I'm really pleased to be here. An hour ago, I was stuck on the M25 in heavy rain, thinking it was an impossible task, but I've made it, and we're all really delighted as well to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight about the SPAB's Old House project and also our working party and activities at nearby Boxley Abbey. These are two separate projects for us, but they're neatly dovetailed together, if you like, and have proved extremely important to our work over the last 3 or 4 years. Central to this too, and all credit due here to Kent Archaeological Society, as well as other archaeological groups who've been our active partners along the way in what we're doing. Graham Keevil will say a bit more, I'm sure, about the various ways other archaeologists have been involved in what we've been up to. But I think it's important to note that the archaeology at Boxley has, for us, been quite a departure from anything we've been doing in the past. Despite our very long history of over 145 years, the SPAB and archaeology haven't had a huge amount of overlap. But here at Boxley, the two disciplines, building conservation and archaeology, have come together really neatly. And I think we have gained enormously from that partnership. So thank you so much for the help that you've given along the way. Now, let me tell you just a little bit first by way of introduction about us, the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, and what we're up to. Some of you, I'm sure, will have come across us already, but if not, we like to claim to be the country's oldest building conservation body, founded way back in 1877 by William Morris, Philip Webb, and others around him in the pre-Raphaelite movement, but designers, architects, but basically just people who loved ancient buildings and wanted to secure their protection. Today, we have quite a wide range of advisory and educational roles. These include many courses. We've been at Boxley today, for instance, running a hedge laying course, which has been really important as a complementary activity to the building work that's going on. We also run in the centre there a free technical advice service where anyone can ring up on a weekday morning, ask us a question about their care or maintenance of old buildings. We suggest specialists too if they're needed. It's just one of our charitable functions. And we have a statutory role within the listed building consent system. So local authorities are obliged to notify us of applications that involve a degree of demolition of listed buildings, and then we offer advice. We don't make the final decision on those applications. Everything we do is based on the document on the right called the SPAB approach, which has my name on it, but really it's a cumulative product of work over those 145 years and firmly rooted in William Morris's manifesto of 1877. The approach contains some very straightforward and simple ideas. Fundamental to everything is understanding what you're dealing with, and that's understanding in a technical structural sense, but very much too in a historical sense. So knowing what you've got and what you're dealing with is the critical starting point for the SPAB. We then promote the value of good maintenance, doing things regularly, looking after the small problems to avoid the big ones emerging. But where repair is necessary, we urge something we call conservative repair. That's about doing what's necessary, but no more than that, and doing it in a way that's honest and expresses the fact that a change has happened, as these two examples here illustrate. So let's move on then to the Old House project. This is just a quick introduction from me, and then I'll pass on to Johnny to explain about some of the actual work that's been happening over the last couple of years. So in the past, the SPAB was the owner and repairer of many historic buildings. Just one example is that on the left. You may well know it extremely well or have passed it on a regular basis. It's the Wealdon Hall restaurant at Larkfield, repaired by us, but sold on many years ago and now a thriving restaurant. But in recent decades, we moved away from this kind of activity. We were focused on advice giving and on training activities, and this had rather taken us away from the practical doing of things. So in 2016, the SPAB took a significant strategic decision that it wanted to take on a new demonstration project as a means of showing what we were all about. And this was the catalyst for a 2-year nationwide hunt to find the right building until we finally alighted upon St Andrews at Boxley. After a lot of thinking and some careful valuations on both sides, we agreed a purchase price of £60,000, which was either a lot or a very little, depending on your perspective. But it was essentially a fair price, agreed by both parties as the right money for the building. And for us, it had to deliver many things, but its value was having a great mix of traditional materials, right through from stone to timber framing to tiling, and also some really challenging repair problems. There was no point for us in taking on a building that was easy to fix. We wanted something to get our teeth into educationally. Outside, the building was covered in undergrowth, and inside, it had been disused for a full half century. And was a remarkable survival as such. It even had some 1960s tins still left in the cupboard. So very atmospheric, but also really starting to decay very rapidly and suffering from vandal damage and other problems of that kind. So our objectives were to deliver several things over a 5-year period. Fundamentally, we wanted to demonstrate the SPAB approach to building conservation and sustainability too. We wanted to do as much educational work as possible, and that's where things link in with the working parties at Boxley Abbey. We wanted to pursue research objectives, especially around lime production and energy efficiency. And ultimately, we had to produce a habitable, saleable building in order to get the Society's money back. So just a quick bit of context. St Andrews stands very close to Boxley Abbey. The precise relationship between the Abbey and St Andrews Chapel is still being explored, but it seems clear that there is a very strong historical link. Quite likely, Debbie may like to comment on this in due course, but quite likely is that the chapel was a reliquary building holding a saint's relic linked to pilgrimage, which was central to Boxley Abbey's activities. For me too, you can see the chapel ring there in orange on the left-hand side, and the blue arrow indicates the surviving inner precinct wall, but for me, very probably St Andrews stands on the line of the outer precinct and former outer precinct of the Abbey itself. As you may well know, at the dissolution in the 1530s, the Abbey passed to the Crown, and shortly afterwards was handed over to courtier Thomas Wyatt, who lived, of course, at nearby Allington Castle. So a very obvious reason for him to want to acquire the Abbey's lands for his family. Then followed a long period about which we're still trying to find out more, but pretty clear is that St Andrews just was part of the Boxley Abbey estate, and this position continued right on through until the late 1960s, when the chapel was finally sold out of the Abbey's hands. From the mid-18th century, certainly, it served as an estate cottage and domestic building, as shown here on the left. And on the right, rather lovely auction particulars from the 1890s, when the whole estate, including St Andrew's Chapel, was sold on. So during our 4 years of ownership since 2018, we've done as much documentary research into the building's history as possible. In particular, thanks there go to Debbie Gocher, who's been an enormous help to us. But we've also drawn on local expertise. A historian called Robin Ambrose has been extremely valuable, and also others from KAS have contributed a great deal too. So that's the background. I shall now hand over to Johnny, who will talk you through some of the investigation and repair work and planning and thinking that we've done to date. So, Johnny, I'll click forward the slides when you tell me to. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. And I'd like to echo what Matthew said. Thank you to KAS and MAG and Kerg and particularly Haag for all of their help, expertise and equipment. Without it, we just wouldn't be where we are with this project, and it's a fantastic team that we're working with, and it's been a great pleasure, and I've learned a huge amount as well. But certainly understanding, as Matthew mentioned in the approach, understanding St Andrew's Chapel was our first task back in the end of 2018. We're very lucky to have a lot of people involved in the SPAB who were able to help us out, just like you guys have. Particularly one company is Terra Measurement, who we've all been working very closely with, both at St Andrews and at Boxley. Immediately they came in and did a 3D scan of St Andrew's Chapel, which you can see in the right-hand photo there, using the equipment that you can see in the left-hand photo. That was able to, with that drawings and scans and sections, we were really able to thoroughly understand how the building was built and developed over time, but also the construction and any issues that we had noticed, but could actually work out how far gone they were and whether it was something to worry about. One of those concerns was the west wall, which we're currently working on site as at the moment. Now you can see down in the right hand bottom section of the slide there, the sections through the building wall, and that was just invaluable information that just showed exactly where the west wall had moved through its middle third and therefore needed some support. Next slide, please. Sorry. Other people that helped us right from the beginning was certainly Dr. Martin Bridge, who I'm sure some of you know. He's a dendrochronologist and a huge amount of experience in trying to work out or date buildings, particularly timber frame structures and timber structures, which is what he did at St Andrew's Chapel and the Old House project. Initially, he came in and undertook a dendro survey on the areas which he could tackle, could see, but having got a few question marks, he came back when we were undertaking repairs to the roof, and that then just opened up a whole new world, and I wouldn't say flipped everything on its head, but certainly galvanized some of our thinking and gave us a lot more information to work with. We also had other people involved who looked at the internal surface finishes, and Catherine Hassel was the lady that was involved there, and it was just fascinating to understand how many times and how often and when the surface finishes changed. And really, as Matthew showed in particulars and auction particulars, we think that a lot of money was probably spent at the end of the 19th century, but after that, really there wasn't much change. And so we're taking on a building that hasn't been lived in for 50 years, but is actually decorated in a way that was coming from Victorian period, and it was a real time capsule in that way. Next slide, please, Matthew. One of the first bits that we tackled in physical work was the roof. As William Morris says, fix a leaky roof, and that's exactly what we did. We had actually set aside money to actually renew the whole roof. We thought it would possibly need that when we were first looking and undertook a condition survey. But actually, through further investigations and understanding the building, we realised that the roof that you could see in the early photos with the family standing in front of the building and beautiful shots of St Andrew's Chapel in the background, that roof was actually perfectly okay, other than where trees had rubbed against tiles and where repairs had been undertaken mainly due to vandalism and manufactured tiles had been put in place of handmade tiles, and then they had started to break down and delaminate quicker than the handmade tiles. So therefore leaks occurred, and then that rotted some of the roof structure. But really it was only very small amounts. So we actually undertook trying to make the tiles ourselves using the clay from underneath the site. We realised when we needed 3,500 of them for mainly the new post office roof, that was going to be impossible. So we went to William Blythe's, who are up in Hull. They have a 130-year-old coke-fired kiln, which is very much a traditional way of burning tiles. And using their clay, we then produced 3,500 tiles, which actually we had a sponsor a tile, and through the SPAB, which very gratefully, a lot of very wealthy members, I suppose, were able to help us. And £25 was what you could pay for a tile, but some people paid nearly £2,500 for a tile. So that really helped us with the repairs. Next slide, please. As you can see here, this is the roof works beginning. As Matthew mentioned, one of our ideas behind the taking on the Old House project is the education and training. So we very much wanted to involve as many people as we could, from students right up to the most experienced of building people. We had an extra wide scaffold which allowed that, and we also had access via the you can see in the bottom photo there a system of poles that ran along the ridges, which ladders could then move across without touching the roof, so therefore doing as little damage to the roof as possible, but it just allowed access to the whole roof for repairs and also for investigation purposes. And the scaffold was up for a whole year, so right through the process of repair and following as well. So it was a great education and training aid for us, that. Next slide, please. The other aspect we undertook was analysing the mortar, both at Boxley Abbey and at St Andrew's Chapel, which we discovered to be the same. It was a feebly hydraulic grey chalk mortar taken from the North Downs, mixed with a building sand, a very soft sand that had been taken from the other side of the site where there is a sandstone ridge. Now, we did lots of trials with this mortar, and we felt that we could increase its strength without reducing its breathability. We were very lucky to be given 2 million tonnes if we wanted it, but we only needed actually a couple from the Oxted grey chalk quarry just off the M25. A lot of you probably know it. And we then, with those couple of tonnes of grey chalk, we then burnt it in a lime stabilised soil kiln, which is still on site and actually in use tomorrow. And that provided us with some quicklime, which we can then hydrate and then mix with the local building sand, which the Cistercian monks used, but also added in a little bit of crushed Kentish ragstone, one to give it a little bit more strength, but also to identify where we had been in the building. So as you can see on the right hand side here, we did lots of chimney repairs where it was needed, left the mortar where it was perfectly okay, but just where bricks and mortar had fallen out, we needed to fill it in and point it up with our own mortar. And it's worked incredibly well, as it's feebly hydraulic. It's a pretty tough mortar, but it also, as I hope you agree, looks nice as well and matches in with the original Cistercian mortar that they used. Next slide, please. Not just grey chalk have we tackled in the SPAB's OHP kiln, but also ragstone. Now the building, St Andrew's Chapel, is built from ragstone, and very common building stone, but very rarely was it used as a binder, if ever, mainly because it was impossible to crush it down to a size which you could then burn comfortably. So it was mainly just known as a building stone. But where we have Kentish ragstone on St Andrew's Chapel, which needs repair, as in the surface has delaminated away and become quite soft, we needed to build it up with a mortar repair that was compatible. And what better way than to repair Kentish ragstone than with Kentish ragstone? Now, these slides that you can see with the red banners on them, they are taken from our videos that we have produced over the last few years since working at St Andrew's Chapel and at Boxley Abbey. So please go and have a look on YouTube, under SPAB YouTube, and you'll see the whole sort of process of us making the kiln, burning the stones, and then putting them on the building as trials. Another fascinating side of our lime research and kiln research is that we had a go at taking some septaria off the beach at the Isle of Sheppey and burning it, crushing it down, and then making ourselves some natural cement, which you can see in the bottom right hand slide there. First time in a long time that had happened, and we hope that we can utilize some natural cement in the building as well, going forward. So because we feel that it's another local material that's been forgotten and a little bit misunderstood, and we wanted to make people more aware of the benefits of a natural cement, or a Roman cement, as many people might know it as. Next slide, please. When we took the St Andrews on as a project, we always knew that there was a bit of an easement issue across the site. We thought at first it might have been due to the M20 or Grange Lane or something along those lines, and then slowly, after we got the keys, discovered that we had a huge gas main that ran across the south side of the site, which pretty much fed most of Kent with gas. And the first day we stepped on site, the gas man turned up and said, "Don't go anywhere near it." Of course, that suddenly scuppered a lot of plans that we had for that part of the site. But anyway, we took it on the chin, and we worked with SGN, and initially they said don't go anywhere near the pipe work, but our architect said, well, we really need to cross over it to form a driveway onto site. The Borley Lane entrance is just too narrow and too dangerous to access. So we wanted a slightly more improved access from Grange Lane, which meant 2 years of negotiations and drawings that were put together by the 36 Engineers Regiment in Maidstone. They used it as a bit of a project to design a reinforced concrete bridge to span this pipe. And then we got it installed with a load of help from local volunteers and specialists that we know. And we had a lot of fun doing that. So it now gives us access to the south of the site. And as you drive onto the site, you get a beautiful view of St Andrew's Chapel in the distance there. So it was all worth it. It's just something we weren't expecting to do. Next slide, please. One thing which we were expecting to do and did understand somewhat was the fact that the M20 is 100 feet from the site, and with that comes all the noise and pollution and everything else that comes with it. Certainly, it was something that when we went for a planning application, the local Maidstone Borough Council were keen that we got further research undertaken on the effects of the sound and also air quality on our building, and if anybody was going to live in our building, which hopefully they will, then how that would affect them. We were very lucky again, another local to the Sandling Boxley area, another resident came forward and said, oh, what are you up to and can I help and volunteer? And anyway, after a few conversations, we realised he worked for Socotec, who was a massive engineering firm, which took the St Andrew's Chapel under their wing. And so from a structural monitoring side, they've helped us. From a soil investigation side, they've helped us. And also from a environmental side, so for air quality and also sound quality, they've also helped us, and acoustics. So what we've got here is, on the left hand side, is the original building, which gives some relief to the sound from the M20 on the north side of it. And then the other building on the right is a garage, which we're hoping to put in. It's a proposal we've got planning for now, but that doesn't exist at the moment. And you can see there's a little bit of sound relief behind that. But by putting a wall between the two, which is what our proposal has been, an accepted proposal is, this wall would act as a sound barrier to provide sound relief to the rear garden of St Andrew's Chapel. So when it does become habitable, we sell it to someone in 2024, it will hopefully be a nice garden to be able to sit in, and not just be the sound of trucks and lorries going past. Next slide, please. So this is the actual elevation from the south. So you've got St Andrew's Chapel on the left-hand side there, and then the new extension, relatively modern-looking extension that very gently touches the east end of St Andrew's Chapel. But that then houses a walkway behind this wall, which gives you access to the garage. And I think if you go to the next slide, it should show a plan of it. There you go. So you can see on the left hand side there St Andrew's Chapel, and then this walkway with solar panels on the roof of it. That's what those red checkered sections are. And then the garage with 2 cars in it. But also the garage is mainly for services, so that we can keep all of the services out of St Andrews and leave it minimal interruptions. And of course, as services change over the years, they can easily be changed in the new garage than everything having to be stripped out in the historic building. We are looking at increasing the solar array. We've got a discussion with the services engineer very soon about exactly what we're going to put in, but we really want to make the building as self-sufficient as we possibly can, utilising the south orientation of the site, and possibly solar panels, biomass boiler. It mentions gas boiler there, which is a possibility, and particularly air source heat pumps. But try and limit the amount that the effect of the services on the historic building, but make it in a way that is sustainable and livable for the person in the building. It's a nice warm building. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to pass you across to Graham, which is the bit you're probably all here to listen to, so on the archaeology. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Johnny. Matthew, you can just go straight on to the next slide, please. Okay, what I'm going to do is do a quick description of the kind of work we've been doing so far. I first got involved in around about March 2019, so a little bit after SPAB had actually purchased the building, and indeed I think after Terra Measurement had done their initial surveys. But it was obvious that an archaeologist such as me was going to be needed, whether it be for the below ground elements, or the building itself, and then the detailed studies it would need right the way through the project. I think it's also important to remember several of the photos you've seen so far give a really nice open view, as it is today, of the chapel. But certainly when I first went there, and I know it will have been, you know, the same or more so for Matthew and Johnny and others, it was more like a jungle. You really could barely see the building itself, let alone from one side of the curtilage, the actual land around the building, to the other, and far less yet towards the mothership, if you like, of Boxley Abbey itself. So one of the early pieces of work, relatively early anyway, was to tackle that and to clear out the space, hence the kind of photos you've been able to see so far. But that was an incredibly important piece of work in its own right, because at first it was barely possible to understand that there was even land there, let alone what it might have functioned as historically. The terra measurement survey was particularly useful and important for all of us, but I think perhaps particularly for me, I suppose, in giving a framework for all of the recording that has had to happen, needed to happen, and we wanted to do since then, so that a lot of the real groundwork, if you like, in both a literal and metaphorical sense, was already done for me in particular. And so hence this first slide actually shows a sort of an initial interpretive model of the phasing, the development of the building itself. It's slightly misleading in that the red shade on the roof there should stop a little bit short of the south wall. You need to imagine that sheer slope of the roof, not originally going right the way down. Yes, exactly there. Thanks, Matthew. That would be about the line where that would stop. But that tone, that colour, shows you what we still to a degree understand, and certainly when we first tackled the building understood to be the primary structure, the late medieval chapel itself. Then the light yellow, sort of greeny tone to the right was an addition to that, we thought, medieval in date. And then the sort of dark blue was the early post-medieval, again, as we thought, extensions to the building after the dissolution of the monasteries, when it had become a largely sort of private affair, a residence, broadly speaking. If we go on to the next photo, please, Matthew. This shows a little bit more of the work that's been going on, if you like, in the background. And this is essentially what Martin Bridge has been looking at as the dendro specialist, funded by Historic England, looking at the building itself. So these are the areas he was looking at, again with the same kind of tone, if you like. So the primary elements, trying to get dates for the initial structure of the building, and then the theoretical addition of this little square element on the southeast corner, and then subsequent additions, you know, the slightly later phases, so we thought, of the building. Next slide, please, Matthew. Thanks. So initially we got the dates back. I think, in fact, in the very first stage of the work that Martin did, he was able to successfully date the primary element of the structure, if you like. And it's kind of worth noting, as we go through some of these slides, the overall the previous picture, if you like, that it's grade 2 star listed building. The listing describes it as being probably late 15th century, with then post-dissolution additions of various dates. And it was rather good to get this date back of a felling date, let alone just a range, but a felling date of 1484 for the primary structural timbers of the roof itself, of the chapel element of the building. You can see, even in the plan there, the thickness, if you like, of those primary walls exactly there. But you can also see that on that plan there is a damn great gap at the west end, which Matthew is showing you now, and indeed that south wall, exactly where the pointer is a little bit shorter than the other one. The north wall, we'll come back to that because that's got quite a few ramifications for the overall interpretation of the building. Next slide, please. So moving on, when we had the scaffolding up in 2020, Martin was able to come back and do much more extensive sampling, and that was invaluable in its own right, in that it gave him a lot more dates, but it also helped him to go back to the first set of samples he'd taken a couple of years before, and he was actually able to use both sets together and get better results, if you like, from the first set of samples he'd taken as well as these ones. So the timber framing of this, we thought, still do think, primary element, perhaps the priest's lodging for the reliquary chapel itself, so the priest who would actually serve the chapel and keep a watch over it. The dating for there, we didn't actually have necessarily felling dates, but we had a good range of dates which indicate, at the very least, broadly contemporary with the chapel element. So you can see there the date ranges of the timbers in the later 15th and perhaps just straying into the 16th century, but those ranges are such that the date could be anywhere within those, but it's definitely, broadly speaking at least, contemporary with the roof of the chapel as such. And I say with the roof of, advisedly, for reasons we'll come on to. Next one, please, Matthew. It was when Martin got to the timbers of this, we thought, added on framed range, timber framed range at the southeast corner, that things started to get really interesting, and we're still working through the implications of this, because again, although he got a range of dates rather than absolute felling, it seemed quite clear that the dates for this building were actually earlier, full stop, than the primary element, the chapel, and indeed the priest's lodging, if that's how it did indeed function, which has set us all sorts of challenges. We've been looking at whether it was likely that the timber frame might have been reused in some way. I don't think any of us quite believes that, because it's not easy to reuse a timber frame from a separate building and bring it in and import it to an existing one. It just doesn't work like that. We've sort of, I think, all of us come round to the idea this is genuinely an early part of the structure, and how we then square the circle of a primary chapel being ostensibly later than a framed bay, which we thought was later than it. Well, you know, that's slightly open to discussion, to say the least. I have my own ideas, I'm sure we all do. We can come back to that again in a moment. Next slide, please, Matthew. And then again, another surprise was when we looked at the evidence for the extended element, this bit where part of the building was added to. That didn't behave itself. We were fairly firmly in our own minds looking at this as being a post-dissolution extension for this phase when it becomes a private, broadly speaking, residential property. But with the date range in mind once more, rather than being an absolute felling date, it's quite clear there, as the dates suggest, that the timber we've been able to date, and admittedly it is a timber, but it definitely falls within the medieval period. Is that a reused timber? Well, possibly, but you know, the date we have is the date we have. So all sorts of interesting little conundrums there for us to work through. Next slide, please, Matthew. And then one of the final bits of the jigsaw was getting a date for the spine beam on the ground floor, which is one of the few parts of the extended building, if you like, the reused building, which we were quite confident was going to be post-medieval in date. For various reasons that wouldn't date by dendro, but Martin did get a radiocarbon determination from it, which, as you can see, is in the late 17th or very early 18th century, which tends to support the idea that, for instance, the insertion of a floor into the building, probably the chimney stack itself as well, is substantially post-dissolution in date rather than just slightly. So, you know, that at least behaved itself quite well. Next slide, please, Matthew. Can we move on one? That's it. Great. Thank you. Moving on from that, obviously that's just been one part, and with all the dendro dates has been continuous survey work going on as a part of that. Indeed, at the moment, literally speaking, work has been happening in the last few days on the further opening up of the interior of that same southeastern corner of the building, with all sorts of fascinating results which I haven't even seen yet, let alone can start to interpret for you. But it's a building which is slowly but surely unfolding its secrets before us. But at the same time, we've also been doing work outside, and here once more, as well as up at the Abbey, as you'll hear in a moment, we've been enormously helped by Kevin and Lynn Cornwell and various others from the Hastings Area Archaeological Research Group, and with the assistance of Maidstone Area Research Group, Archaeological Research Group, doing the geophysical survey, as you can see on the right-hand image as you look at it here. I think this might be Kevin himself doing the survey work. And also a series of test pits. I think we're up to 19 test pits and one large trench so far. The geophysical survey on this site wasn't tremendously successful, partly because I think it had only just been cleared at that stage. There was still quite a lot of metal debris on and close to the surface, but also it was an extremely dry time, and with the resistivity, it didn't really respond very well to that. The test pits, again, of the 19 that we've dug so far, something like, well, maybe even as many as 15, have only really had results which are directly related to the foundations of the building, or have had really no archaeological results at all. There have been one or two, which just this last summer, where we started to get really quite exciting results. But as I say, the below ground archaeology has been going hand in hand with the above ground all the way through. Next slide, please, Matthew. Moving on. So these are just a couple of the test pits around the building itself. On the left-hand side, as you look at it, this is the east wall of the chapel. The offset there is, broadly speaking, at the foundation level, so everything below that offset is foundations, everything above it, broadly speaking, is standing wall. It goes down from the offset level about 800 millimeters, slightly less than 3 feet in depth, onto what you can see at the bottom there, a little bit of the natural marl, so they hit what they would have seen as good bearing ground and stopped. Perfectly sensible people. The helpful thing there is that we did have a couple of sherds of very late medieval, sort of late 14th century, perhaps just trending into early 15th, sorry, late 15th, early 16th century sherds from in the foundation trench associated with that. Not a great deal of evidence, but nevertheless sitting very well with both the historically anticipated date of the building and indeed with the dendro dates. And then on the right-hand side, as you look at it, early this year, we did a small test pit inside and uncovered the original extent of the south wall of the building. You remember the slide we were looking at just now, where we were pointing out where both the west wall and a chunk of the south wall had gone. This is the chunk of the south wall where the standing masonry has gone, but lo and behold, not surprisingly, given that we know how deep down it's going to go, the remnant of it is still there. And where the end of the tape measure is, the orange end there, if you can just, that's it, exactly there. That's the original corner, the southwest corner of the building, and indeed just the start of the return of the west wall going across what is otherwise a room now inside the building itself. Next slide, please, Matthew. The work on the entrance off Grange Lane that Johnny was mentioning earlier on, that involved me as well. We had some really quite fun bits and pieces from that. Generally speaking, not a great deal in archaeological terms. There was a gravelled surface which we've picked up in several of our excavations now in this area, which might be natural, might be a deliberately laid surface, but is certainly a major feature of this part of the site. Various bits and pieces of finds, including this rather lovely, on the right hand side, encaustic small mosaic tile with a rather nice little design on it, which you will no doubt have seen on the KAS newsletter cover a couple of issues ago. I have a feeling that some of the animations I've put in here are disappearing, so I'm going to say a little bit more about this rather than, oh, there it is. Thanks, Matthew. Perfect. This particular photo is actually, or image, is from Peter Tester's excavation report of his work at the Abbey itself in 1971, which I'll say a little bit more about when we come on to the Abbey. But when we found that tile at the chapel, I immediately recognized it, thinking, you know, I've seen that before, and lo and behold, looking at Peter's publication report in Art Cant, there it is, that there is an exact equivalent. It is effectively precisely the same piece, but his find was from the Abbey, ours is actually from the chapel site. So there's a nice degree of linkage there. Then in the 1920s, a kiln, a tile kiln for the Abbey was actually found sort of in between the two sites, and we're vaguely hopeful we might be able to get to have a look at that at some point in the future. But this is a good, in some ways, the only physical direct link archaeologically that we have between the two sites at the moment. So next slide, please, Matthew. That's my element of it. Matthew, I don't know if you want to take over these next slides, or
I think keep going, Graham, because I think in the interest of time, it's probably best one of us does it. And I'm really interested to hear what you're going to say. So give us your thoughts, well, and we can debate them later. If
straight on to the next one. I did notice that one of the photos from a previous slide had disappeared, so we'll just this is the next one, which got some animation. We'll just have to hope the animation works. But anyway, it was mentioned earlier on, I think Matthew was talking in terms of how the chapel itself actually functioned, how it operated with the main Abbey site. And it's long been a thought on many of our minds as to whether it was in fact not just a chapel, but actually an outer gatehouse chapel. That concept had really eluded us completely in any terms. We weren't finding any really good evidence historically, Debbie may correct me there, or archaeologically in any of the work we'd done to really go with this, until we dug one particular pit this last summer as part of the working party, and found this really rather nice, quite tasty, quite chunky wall in big Kentish rag blocks, very similar to what we know, because it's still there, is actually in the chapel. And we were starting to wonder, we have started to wonder whether we're just getting the first trace of either the outer precinct wall and or perhaps a gateway associated with it, because as you can see here, there is a very clear end to this structure. This is only one small pit that we dug. We don't know whether it's a genuine gap, whether it's something that's been robbed away, whether we do have a gatehouse or quite what we have, but it's the first tantalizing evidence for it. And hopefully, if the photo will now appear magically, there it is. That shows you the direct relationship between the two. So this is now that same test pit looking back towards the chapel itself, with our newly found wall very much in its context, parallel with the south side of the building, and with that possible opening where the ranging rod, the scale tape is there on the left hand side, sort of opening, aligning quite nicely with the priest's lodging, and I think aligning quite nicely with the doorway between that and the chapel at ground floor level. So, you know, again, very early days, something we're hoping to do more work with. The reason for digging that pit in the first place is that this is where there is going to be a drainage feature, a little swale, a gully, if you like, to catch potential flood water, which is one of the issues, again, we very much have at the chapel moving forwards. So that swale is still going to be there. It's still going to need further excavation without necessarily, well, without full stop damaging this particular structure. That will stay, no doubt, but we will hopefully see more of it and have a much better understanding of how it fits into the overall picture. And I think that's probably my bit so far. Oh, okay, carry on. Just in terms of how it all fits together then, we now have the timber frame bay, as this slide shows, on the southeast corner of the building, which in terms of dendro, is definitely the earliest part of the building we have so far. The chapel itself appears, or at least its roof comes in slightly later, at the end of the 15th century. I do wonder personally whether it's actually a re-roofing, and that the envelope of the masonry structure is actually slightly earlier, and therefore we do still have this contemporary set of structures with the timber frame bay actually going with the stone masonry structure. But without doubt, in terms of the dendro of the timber structures as such, the roof over the chapel is that little bit later than this timber frame section. Moving on, Matthew, please. We then get the extensions themselves, which we do still see as being post-medieval rather than medieval. We do only have the one timber so far, which it has returned this apparently late medieval date. That could very easily be a reused piece rather than an entire frame, which plausibly I don't think could be reused. What is interesting about this part of the building, though, this extension, almost whatever its date is, that it's very clearly reused monastic material and of a very, very high quality indeed. The ashlar masonry there is actually of higher quality than the stonework of the chapel itself, in my mind. It's very, very good masonry, and it's slightly hard to actually work out exactly where it was coming from, not least because when you look at what's left on the abbey site itself, there's nothing of this quality surviving above ground anywhere. So it's still quite a challenge to work that one out. But again, all of the excavations we've done so far have shown that the west wall and most of the south wall, what you see on the main photograph here, has very, very poor foundations indeed. It's just a single course, basically, resting not on good bearing geological ground, but on, relatively speaking, what an engineer would term made ground. So again, if it's shown, as it indeed it has, some structural stresses in the past, it's not necessarily that surprising. The amazing thing in a way is this massive structure of this extended part of the building has survived with such apparently poor foundations under a large part of it. Next slide, please, Matthew. The chimney stack and the internal first floor, we know were introduced around about 1700 now, from the dendro dating, and indeed from what we would expect from the overall character of the masonry and the use. But perhaps following on from a period when the interior of the building was in effect an open hall, whether for domestic or otherwise use at this stage, we don't know. Next slide, please, Matthew. And then there is a bit which we haven't really talked much about, which is the small timber framed element on the northwest corner, which was erected probably just before 1900, so late 19th century addition. And then the latest phase of the internal use, the evidence for which is all still very much there, is this slightly unusual early 20th century stuff, the fireplace, and in particular an amazing collection of Art Deco lino floor coverings, which are a challenge in their own right. So that sort of brings the building up to almost the date when it fell out of use, around about 1960. Next slide, please. And Matthew, perhaps you might want to
just to wrap up. Thank you, Graham. That was a wonderful rounding up quickly of our thinking at the moment, and I agree wholeheartedly with what you say. But if you want to learn more, plenty of information about the Old House project on our website, and we're thrilled already to have won an award for the project, particularly for its kind of community engagement and digital work, but rather fraudulently perhaps, given that we've still got a couple of years to go. But in the interest of time, let us now move over the fence towards Boxley Abbey, which is not in the SPAB's ownership, but has become a really integral part of what we're trying to do. And I think this is Johnny's bit, first of all.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Yes, Boxley working parties. Now, the SPAB have been running working parties since the early 1980s, so pretty much 40 years now, and no doubt before then there was gatherings of friends interested in repairing old buildings, and but it's something that has built up over that 40 years to groups of, say, 10, 15, 20 people, to the working parties that we run at Boxley Abbey now, where we have maybe up to 150 people on site, and split up into various groups of work. But I'll come on to that in a second. This is the plan of Boxley Abbey, the tier-shaped inner precinct wall there, and St Andrews indicated with the red circle, with the M20 100 feet away. So it's quite a nice site, but a large site for us to work on, and has many interesting buildings and areas to it, which we've been investigating over the last, well, since 2019. Next slide, please. So this is the entrance to the gatehouse of Boxley Abbey, and at every working party we fix our flag to the to close to the entrance as we possibly can, to let everyone know that we're here for the week. Next slide, please. And it's a gathering, as I say, up to 100, 150 people, with visitors coming along as well. But generally it's a mix of students, homeowners, professionals, craftsmen, builders, of varying kinds. It's what's lovely about it is that you can have people who are highly educated working with people who are just starting their career, and everybody gets on, and it's just fantastic. So this is our NASA control, where everything is discussed, and we have our briefing first thing in the morning before everybody then goes off and does their little bit of work around the site. Next slide, please. So one of the areas of work which we have been working on is the garden wall at Boxley Abbey. It's a Kentish ragstone wall, very similar to the one at St Andrew's Chapel. And because it's listed rather than scheduled, it was an ideal first place to sort of practice some of our techniques on. So when we arrived at the wall, it was absolutely covered with ivy. It had no coping to it. You can see where the sections of the wall had just collapsed, and even since having done a condition survey, went back 6 months later, and another large section of about 30-40 feet had collapsed. So it was really at the end of its tether, and we needed to do something. So by understanding, as I mentioned earlier, and analysing the mortars that we had found across the site, including this wall, we were able to come up using our kiln with our mix of mortar. That's feebly hydraulic grey chalk mortar, which we mixed with the local sands and the crushed Kentish ragstone, as I mentioned, and we were able to apply that to this wall, and as a bit of a trial before we used it at St Andrew's Chapel and more important parts of the, or more scheduled, let's say, parts of the site. And it was a great success. So we've been rebuilding and repairing and repointing the wall, and then putting a soft capping on top. If you go to the next slide. So we have other areas of the walled garden that we worked on, brickwork, standard sort of brickwork to the left-hand slide picture, and then we have some gauge brickwork on the right-hand pictures. We're very, very lucky indeed to have some incredible specialists that work with us, alongside all of the KAS and MAG and Kirk and Haag specialists who do deal with the archaeologists, and working alongside Graham. We also have specialists in timber framing and brickwork, as in Lynn here, in the mortars and burning of lime, and everything, basically surveying of every type. And it's a fantastic group that give their time up for volunteers, who are the guys in the yellow tops, to be able to work alongside. Next slide, please. As you can see here, this is the hospitium on the left-hand side, where we had, after quite a strong breeze or storm, a number of the Kent peg tile had slipped, and therefore we got a genie cherry picker in to repair that this summer. But we also, so we're using the modern technology to help us repair the building, but also the most traditional techniques as well. And as you can see on the right hand side here, got John Russell and his team pit sawing one of the beams, which then went into the hospitium to repair the ancient well, Cistercian floor. So that was a really great repair, and you're more than welcome to come and see that. Next slide, please. Okay, pass you over to Graham again, who will talk about the archaeology, which has really just brought the working party to life, and we're really grateful for it. So over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Johnny. One of the things Johnny's just mentioned there a couple of times is the scheduled area. Many of you will already know the Boxley Abbey, the entirety essentially of the precinct area defined by that outer wall is a scheduled monument, so it's very, very closely protected in law, specifically really for its below ground archaeology. It's interesting that the hospitium is actually included in the schedule as well as being a listed building, whereas for the most part otherwise the listings aren't included within the schedule, but the ground underneath them is. That has been to a degree a challenge for us, in that I think we probably all didn't feel in our heart of hearts that we were very likely to get the chance to actually do any substantive excavations at Boxley Abbey within the lifetime of SPAB's interest in the site, which is obviously will go on for a long time yet. But specifically within the working parties, at least, we were doubtful whether we would get that chance. But for various reasons, we have had that chance. Quickly, it's again, I mentioned just now Peter Tester's work in 1971. His was the first really substantive excavations, or indeed archaeological work at all, at the Abbey. There had been 19th century and I think early 20th century investigations, but Peter's work with a whole series of test pits all across the core of the Abbey itself had been the first attempt really to understand the overall layout and development of the buildings from a purely archaeological perspective. Because as you can imagine, a lot changed at the dissolution. There was a private house, a grand house, which developed through several stages to get to where that house is today. So there's been all sorts of changes, but Peter really addressed that and answered a lot of those questions. But not surprisingly, perhaps, given the sheer scale of the site and this aspect of it having the scheduled designation, he didn't really look beyond that, and nor had any of us, except with sort of longing perhaps, looked at the precinct. But one of the first things that was done as part of this project was to carry out major geophysical surveys within the precinct, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But next slide, please, Matthew. As another part of the scheme, we wanted to get a better understanding of how one specific aspect of the underground element of the site was working, or perhaps more to the point, wasn't. You'll be aware, I'm sure, that water management was a fundamental element of any medieval monastic estate, and especially so for the Cistercians, who were master water engineers. That element rather fell by the wayside, and to a degree at least, in the post-dissolution period. A lot of the water courses were still maintained and reused for garden features in some way, feeding new ponds and the like, but a lot of it really started to fall into some disarray. And so one element that KAS have been doing has been to explore and map out the underground drainage and water channels on the site, which is what a lot of little circles on here represent, all under schedule monument consents to allow these really very targeted and very small scale excavations to happen, but also as a matter of doing that to sort of follow things like here on this photograph is the rear daughter in the Abbey itself, to try and follow a lot of the drainage and into and out from that feature, and indeed all across the site. So really important work in its own right. Next slide, please, Matthew. But more to the point, and say we have, I say grandly, we, from this point of view, Kevin and Lynn Cornwell particularly, and the Hastings Area Archaeological Research Group, with help from Maidstone archaeologist Stephen Clifton and several others, Nick Hill included, to do an amazing array of geophysical survey, effectively covering the whole of the ground of the scheduled area where it can be surveyed. There are areas of woodland where you can't survey realistically, but probably 75, maybe 80% of the precinct has been surveyed using both magnetometry and resistivity, and an area outside has been looked at as well. Next piece, please, Matthew. Should have another image. Yeah, here we are. This is Kevin and Lynn's survey work on the core area of the abbey itself. So an area that Peter Tester had looked at a lot in the 1970s, but you can hopefully see from the geophysical survey that we have a lot more now, particularly up in that top right-hand corner, where there is a range of probably monastic phase buildings. To the top left-hand corner, similarly, the area of the walled garden, the big area on the right-hand side there, lots and lots of really tasty anomalies for us to perhaps get a chance to have a look at in the future. But really looking from that core outwards to cover the whole of the site in a way that I think is, if not unique, then certainly unusual. I don't think there are many other medieval monastic precincts that have been looked at in the way that Kevin and Lynn have been able to do here. And 100% credit to them for the amazing work they've done over a prolonged period of time. A hell of a lot of work has been put in from their and other people's point of view on this particular element, and we wouldn't have got anywhere with the next few slides had it not been for this bit of work. Next one, please, Matthew. Following on from that, we've also been looking at the LiDAR imagery. This is the 1 meter contour DTM, digital terrain model. There is a 50 centimeter one which keeps the trees in, but this is the one where you can look through the trees, and you can see there the complexity of the earthworks, some of which you can actually see on the ground, but a lot of which really only come out with the LiDAR, or more particularly with the radar survey. And from this image, just concentrate briefly on the northern area, the top right hand corner in effect of the slide, because this is an area where, exactly there as Matthew is indicating, Kevin and Lynn have got some good results from the geophysical surveys, which should come in now. Next image, yes, here we are. On the left here, this is for roughly half of that area, the left-hand half, if you like, the western half. Magnetometer survey on the left, resistivity survey on the right, complementing each other very well, with some overlap in terms of the features showing through, but also some quite distinct differences. But again, you can see that a lot of that represents quite well on the LiDAR imagery as well as on the geophysics. And it's clear that we're getting stratigraphy even in the LiDAR and geophysical survey results, particularly on the resistivity, that area on the bottom right hand corner, again, which shows up very well on the LiDAR. You clearly have one set of structures and features overlying another. Moving on, please, Matthew. But it was when really we came to the field to the north of the Hospitium, and therefore also to the west of the primary abbey, that I think the results really got us all going. This is the magnetometry. I think I'll be corrected on that one if I'm wrong. But anyway, this is, yeah, I think this is right. This is the area immediately in front of north of the Hospitium, and it was apparent from very early on the early plots that Kevin and Lynn showed us within a day or so of having done their survey here, that there was some pretty special intensive stuff going on with multiple features, and again obviously phasing of features one on top of another, and in particular they're the ones which are numbered 8, 9, 7, I think. You've got this large circular feature about 23 meters in diameter there. You've got a linear feature crossing it roughly diagonally. which is 9, I think, there, as Matthew is showing with the cursor. And to the north of that, a massive complex of all sorts of things going on. You can make out potential wall and foundation lines in there. There is a big linear feature cutting across it. There's intense activity at the top left-hand side, anomaly 1. Amazing complexity of material showing through. And it set us all, I think, wondering whether there was a chance that we would actually be given schedule monument consent to actually do some excavations. So we met with Liam Delaney, the recently appointed Assistant Inspector of Ancient Monuments, who is effectively becoming our case officer for this area. In, I think it was early May this year, we'd already sent Historic England the results of the geophysical surveys as up to date as we could at the back end of last year. We'd been pursuing a meeting with them. We finally got that meeting in early May, and we were all, I think, slightly shocked but also delighted to hear that Liam was quite happy with the idea of a potential schedule monument consent to carry out some excavations in this area. And again, we all on the project team want to share all the credit where it's due, and we do need to give a considerable round of applause, if you like, metaphorically but literally really, to Liam, because he went out on quite a limb to press the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport to actually grant the SMC in time for us to do the work at the working party in early July this year. So we had from meeting on site through the whole SMC process to being on site digging the pits in 2 months, which is not far short of miraculous. But anyway, if we bring in the next photo, please, Matthew. There we go. It's also important that we keep coming back to the documentary evidence for the whole of the site. And this was something that is particularly important as it became for the results of the archaeological work. This is a survey carried out of the Abbey site itself, an estate survey in 1801, and it basically shows the whole of the precinct. Again, I've just snapshot a relatively small part of it, but it does include the same area, so you could fit in the area of the geophysical survey on the left-hand side there into that area that Matthew is indicating now. And in terms of the map, there are a couple of points I do just want to highlight there for you. One is, if Matthew can just about show it, there is a little stream channel running diagonally down towards a pond, which is to the left of the Hospitium, that channel there, which also shows through on the geophysical survey as feature number 11. Over there, exactly there. But also at the top right-hand end of that water channel on the historic map, there is a small building, which if you can just maybe manage to highlight that, that's the one exactly. You won't be able to necessarily see it, but the internal arrangement of that is exactly the same as an area at the west end of the Hospitium, which is clearly shown as a stable. It actually refers to it as stables and stable stalls. And that little building to the north of the Hospitium, I think, must have been a small stable as well, which becomes relevant as we quickly go through the results from the excavations. So next slide, please, Matthew. This is the first day of our excavations, whatever day it was, back in early July now, with Hospitium in the background. Stephen Clifton, Nick Hill, Kevin and Lynn Cornwell in the middle there with my wife Kathy on the left, just literally taking the turf off on the first of our trenches. And on the next slide here on the right hand side is that same excavation, now looking eastwards back towards the Abbey, if you like. And really just on taking the topsoil off, we came down onto this flint cobble layer, nicely in position for our circular structure. Now, initially I resisted firmly the idea that we'd actually found the circular structure. I wanted it to be something, you know, really archaeologically sexy, damn great Iron Age roundhouse or whatever it might be. I didn't really envisage it being a late post-medieval structure, which is what it is. The structure perhaps being a slightly loose term for it, but we found this in 2 of the excavations, and by extending this trench a little bit, as you'll see shortly, we did find both sides of it. So there's no real doubt that this is that big 23-metre diameter circular feature that Kevin and Lynn picked up in the geophysical survey. What I think it is, it's definitely very late. It's perhaps a late 18th, early 19th century structure. I think interpretatively that it's actually a horse training ring, which goes obviously with that little stable building, so that someone would stand in the middle with the horses on a long rope and would just literally encourage them to go round and round this thing. So that appears to be what that particular structure was. We also found the linear feature running across it, and that proved to be, again, we're pretty certain post-medieval in date, just underlying the trackway. It didn't show through in this trench. It was on the next one just to the right of the image here. But we did pick that up as well, and that also we think is post-dissolution in date. Next slide, please, Matthew. But it's one we got to the lower levels of this big trench that we really started to sort of really drive home both the brilliance of the geophysical survey and also the amazing character and quality of the archaeology in this part of the precinct, in that once we'd taken off the track surface and gone down a little bit further, we started to see emerging patches of stonework, which again, initially none of us were greatly convinced looked like walls, but the more we saw of them, the more we exposed, and it was quite clear that we had what effectively is the end of a building. And then as we carried on going down a little bit further, here we have Kevin and Stephen actually in the trench, and on the right hand side Stephen merrily beavering away in what we quite clearly have as a really nice stone line culvert, a water feature. This being stratigraphically the earliest element that we have on this particular part of the site. And in effect there, you see all three major phases that we had on the geophysical surveys all being completely confirmed within this relatively small excavation. And the next image, which will come through here, this is Stephen's 3D model of the trench taken as sort of a LiDAR scan, if you like, on the wonders of digital technology now on an iPhone. Expressed as a plan, and there you see the phases of the excavation and indeed the geophysical survey. At the left hand end we have the remnant of the trackway, the flint trackway surviving. The right hand half of the trench we have our stone building, and that respects and effectively butts up against the water culvert running through the middle. And that had a fantastic assemblage of pottery in it, everything from good quality Roman material through a very nice later medieval assemblage, and then in the upper levels earlier post-medieval material as well. So we have the date range, we have what we're pretty comfortable is a late medieval water channel, we have a post-medieval building associated with it, and perhaps even with the channel still being active at that stage, we can't be certain of that, and then the late post-medieval trackway, horse training trackway on top of that. On the next image, as that flies in, we should see that, there you get that in relation to the geophysical survey again. This particular trench is trench 1, so you can see there how it relates to the imagery, if you like, the wonders of the geophysical survey. So we have that circular ring as the latest feature. We have the linear feature that was picked up in trench 2 as the earlier than that. And you can see there the line, well, both of the building itself, where that comes across, and you can still see it on the right hand side there. Matthew, can you just indicate the line of the wall there, really from the top of the box, exactly there. You can see that wall line running through to the right. So we have at least one building there, but the culvert is that stronger feature running from the north, that one exactly, seeming to carry all the way through, gradually getting fainter the further north it goes, but certainly picking up, I think, all the way through the survey, right the way to the top of the field, and then immediately to the south of our trench 1, turning right and continuing off eastwards towards the Abbey. So an important, obviously, part of the overall water. Apparent buildings to the north and east are, and we are very much hopeful. We already have in effect a sort of a framework consent for further work in future years. We're hopeful that we will get at least one more season of excavations here, in tandem, at least in part, with the working parties. And we still need to have the conversation with Liam from Historic England. But one set of features we'll obviously be looking towards, now that we've answered a lot of the questions we had about these particular features, is that mass of archaeology in the northeastern part, exactly there, of the site. So that's a quick whiz through the results this year. Fantastic results. I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who participated, the SPAB volunteers, but particularly Kevin, Lynn, Nick, Stephen and others from our local partners, who quite literally we couldn't have done it without you. So thanks to everyone from that point of view for all the amazing work you've done thus far, and hopefully will continue to do so with us on the project. I think that concludes my bit, Matthew.
Yes, thank you so much, Graham. A wonderful survey, a gallop through a huge amount of work, but thanks to all involved from the SPAB. Just to wrap up, a final slide, which is just to show you how our working party season ended, this year at least. We linked up with the Spitalfields Trust to do a sort of pilgrimage linked to the fact that both sites have pilgrimage connections. Unfortunately, we chose one of those very hottest days of the year in July to do this walk of 18 miles, but it was still a wonderful experience. And perhaps if we're brave enough to do it again, some of you would be interested to join us on a future occasion. It was a memorable experience in many ways. So thank you all very much indeed.